Open up, please, to the book of Ruth, chapter 3 this morning. If you don't have a Bible, this is certainly a week that you will want to grab one from the pew in front of you and turn there to Ruth, chapter 3. If you're in the pew Bible, you can find the page number of where you'll be in the bulletin this morning. There's a joke that Charlene from Good News Club thought I should be made aware of, and it's very fitting for this morning. It was from a newspaper article, but it said the preacher's 5-year-old daughter noticed that her father always paused and bowed his head for a moment before starting his sermon. And one day, this 5-year-old daughter asked him why he did that. "Well, honey," he began, proud that his daughter was so observant of his messages, "I'm asking the Lord to help me preach a good sermon." And his daughter looked confused and asked, "Well, Daddy, how come he doesn't answer your prayers?" And that is very fitting for me this morning. I have been praying fervently that the Lord would help me to preach faithfully the text this morning in Ruth chapter 3. And if you are familiar with Ruth chapter 3, you know why I have been praying fervently that the Lord would help me to preach Ruth chapter 3. But before we dive in there, I want to make sure we are all caught up this morning and we understand what's happened so far in the story. So briefly, I want us to fast forward through chapters 1 and 2, and then we will dive into the long-awaited Ruth chapter 3. But in Ruth 1, we met a family. Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And where they were living in Bethlehem, there was a famine in the land. And so they picked up from Bethlehem. And they were in dire need. They were worried that they would die there in Bethlehem from starvation. So they were in dire need and picked up and moved to Moab. And in Moab, instead of escaping death, they found death. I titled my sermon for that week, "The Journey of Loss," because they faced loss after loss. Naomi's husband Elimelech died while they were there. And then Mahlon and Chilion, her 2 sons, married Moabite women, but then without having any children, those Mahlon and Chilion also died. So just 3 widows there in Moab, Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. And they decide, God again had proved himself faithful to his people in Bethlehem and provided food for them. And so Naomi decides we should head back and go back to Bethlehem. And they set out to go, and Naomi realizes, I've got nothing to offer you, Ruth and Orpah. Just go back. And Orpah says, okay, you're right. You've got nothing for me. I'm out of here. And she goes back to Moab. But Ruth says, no, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stick with you. I'm going to follow you. Be faithful to your God, the one true God. Be faithful to God's people. And so they arrive there in Bethlehem. But you can just see Naomi is broken. She is running on empty. After the 10-year nightmare that she had just faced in Moab, she is empty and bitter. And the barley harvest was just about to begin. So last week in chapter 2, we saw what happened in the barley harvest. And Ruth meets a man named Boaz. Now we've been rooting for Ruth and Boaz. And in chapter 2, the narrator says Boaz has 2 descriptions. One, a man of great standing, perhaps wealth, perhaps social status. He's a man of great standing, but he also happens to be a kinsman or guardian redeemer. Now it's very important we understand that aspect of the scriptures here as we approach this chapter, because a guardian redeemer was a law that God set in place to care for his people. Essentially, widows had nothing. They did not have land. They did not have a way to care for themselves, provide for themselves, protect themselves. And so when a woman's husband would die, she was in great need. And so God put in place that the late husband of the now widow, that his closest unmarried relative would marry the widow for a number of reasons. One, simply just for protection and care and provision, but also to have a child that would act as the heir of the late husband, to carry on the late husband's name. But it would also secure for that widow the land of her husband through this guardian or kinsman redeemer. So it was incredibly important. And Boaz happened to be a kinsman redeemer of Ruth. And Ruth just happens to find herself in Boaz's field to work. So we saw that they met each other. Remember, Boaz said, "Who is she?" Does she have a ring on her finger? Is she married? And they met together, and Boaz just pours out graciousness and kindness towards Ruth. And we've been rooting for them that they would make a move, that Boaz would make a move, and they would get together, they would get married, and they'd live happily ever after. But at the end of chapter 2, it says Ruth had finished there working in the harvest in Boaz's field, and she was still living with her mother-in-law. Nothing had happened. And so chapter 3, we are eager this morning to get to the text to see what's going to happen with Ruth and Boaz. And I want us to kind of break this down into 3 sections. We'll read a portion of the text and then talk a bit about it and read the next portion, but 3 portions this morning. First being the plan in verses 1 through 5. So read with me, just soak in, imagine you're there in the text, and soak in, first of all, verses 1 through 5 of Ruth chapter 3 as I read. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, he is our relative. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he's finished eating and drinking." Verse 4, when he lies down, note the place where he is lying, go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now, we were eager for Ruth and Boaz to get together, right? That's not exactly how we pictured things playing out. What in the world is going on in Ruth chapter 3? I mean, we're on board with the first part, right? Naomi says in verse 1, "My daughter Ruth, I need to find a home for you." And that word home is not simply just a roof over her head, but it indicates more a place of rest. I need to find a place of rest for you. Essentially, Naomi is saying, we've got to get you married, where you will find rest, comfort, provision, protection under the roof of a husband's household, right? Remember, it's different than today's context. The widow was in very much need. And so Naomi says, we've got to find a home, a place of rest for you. To which we can say, amen, we're ready for that. And then she says, now, remember, Boaz, whose women you've worked with, he's a relative of ours. Essentially, Naomi is scheming here. I don't know if you've ever had a scheming mother-in-law, but that's what Naomi is. And she says, you need to find a home. Oh, and remember Boaz? He is a relative of ours. Essentially, he's an eligible bachelor to be your kinsman redeemer. So far, we're on track. And I see Ruth nodding her head. Okay, yes, I know Boaz. He's been kind to me. Tonight, Naomi says, there later in verse 2, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Now, last week, I got a lesson on barley from John to help me understand winnowing and the threshing floor. Essentially, I'll spare you all the details, but remember last week we talked about the men would cut the stalks of barley and they would fall to the ground, and the women would gather them together into what are called sheaves, just bundles. And they would take those bundles to the threshing floor and have cattle walk all on them, and it would loosen the grain, the good part, the edible part, loosen the grain from the rest of the stalk and the head. And so that inedible part was called the chaff, the rest of the head that you really don't eat. And so winnowing on the threshing floor, you'd take a winnowing fork and you'd scoop up the mixture there of the stalk and the chaff and the grain, and you toss it in the air. And Naomi says he'll be out there tonight doing exactly that. And they did it in the evening because the wind would have a nice breeze that would go by, a steady breeze. So when you toss that mixture into the air, it would blow away that inedible part, but the heavier grain would fall back down to the floor. So eventually you're just left with the grain. And so far, we're all on board. And verse 3, it's a little bit more iffy, but we're okay. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. And for this, I see Ruth nodding. Okay, I'm not exactly catching what you're trying to say here, but that sounds okay so far. And I want to make sure we understand that word best clothes is not maybe what we should think of. Because it's not that Naomi was telling Ruth to go dress provocatively. But that word there for the garment she was wearing was more than likely one that covered the whole body except for the head. In fact, some would suggest that Ruth, this entire time, has been wearing the traditional garments of a grieving widow. That there were specific clothes you wore if you were a widow. And so up until now, perhaps she has worn those widowing garments. And later, now, here, Naomi says, it is time to move on, to get past that grieving period, and I want you to go see Boaz. So take off the garments of a widow and put on other clothes. Here translated as best clothes. But then verse 4. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Go uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. As I picture Ruth and Naomi having this conversation again, Naomi says, we've got to find you a home. Ruth, okay, yeah, that sounds good. You remember Boaz? Oh, yes, I remember Boaz. He's been so kind to me. Okay, I want you to go, and I want you to wash, put on perfume, get rid of your widow clothes, and put on new clothes. Okay, that's fine. And I want you to go and uncover his feet when he's asleep and lie down. What? You want me to do what? Now, listen, this is all conjecture because we don't know exactly what Ruth was thinking, but that's the point where I see Ruth, her eyes get big, her jaw drops, and so does the readers, and we wonder, what in the world is Ruth going to do? In verse 5, we see Ruth responds with, I will do whatever you say. Unusual text, but I'm going to make you wait to see exactly what we have going on here, because we'll see this begin to play out in the next section. We have the plan. I want us to look at the next section that I have called the proposal. And so just take it in. I want to read verses 6 through 13. And I just want you to put yourself there in the story and just begin to take it in. So Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking, he was in good spirits, and he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. And Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night. And in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. My goodness. What are we to do with Ruth chapter 3? I want us to begin to break this down and really put ourselves here in the story and see what exactly is going on here. We saw in verse 6 that she did exactly what Naomi told her to do. She went down to the threshing floor. And in verse 7 it says Boaz had finished eating and drinking, was in good spirits. There's no indication here in the text that he was drunk. This simply, have you ever heard the word hangry? Have you ever been hangry before? Hangry is a word that combines two different words of hungry and angry. It's the kind of irritable you get when your stomach's really growling and all you can think about is food. And so you get just a touch hangry. Naomi essentially here is saying, don't go to him and do this when he's hangry. Let him eat, get a good meal, and then he'll be in better spirits. There's no indication here that Boaz is, for some reason, getting drunk. But he goes and he eats, he drinks, and he lies down at the far end of the grain pile. And Ruth approaches quietly. If you ever try to put Emmett down to sleep, you'll have to do a very specific set of steps. You have to pat his bottom the right way and rock in the right motion and sing a few hymns, and his eyes will just begin to close a bit, and he'll fight it and he'll fight it, a few cries here and there, but then he'll finally be asleep. And you have to do this maneuver where you get up and set him in his crib, but roll him just the right way so your hands can come out and you're not going to wake him. And then quickly, but avoiding the creaks in the floor, you have to make your way out of the room, just praying he's not going to wake up. That's how I picture Ruth here in this text, as she's just waiting for Boaz to fall asleep. And he finally goes to sleep, and so she moves about on the floor quietly, avoiding making too much noise. And then she goes and uncovers his feet, and she lies down next to him. And what I find hilarious is in verse 8. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. Perhaps it was the cool breeze on his legs. He was a bit cold, and so he reaches down perhaps to cover his legs back up and realizes there's a woman there at his feet. And his natural question that he goes to is, who are you? What are you doing here? Who are you? It was dark, and so, of course, he was probably a bit groggy. He just woke up in the middle of the night, and there's a stranger lying at his feet. And Ruth's response seems so calm to me. She says, I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, let's stop there. It's difficult for us as we read this text to really understand what's going on here because it uses language that we are not quite familiar with. And some would say during this time period, prostitutes would often go out to the threshing floor and offer their services to the men there at night. And some commentators would say Ruth is basically doing the same thing. She's going and is going to somehow engage in some sort of sexual immorality. She's offering herself to Boaz. That is not the picture that the text paints. Certainly, as we look at the text, we have a moment of pause thinking, are they going to mess this up? I mean, God set specific standards for his people in marriage. Are they going to mess this up? But I want you to look at the focus of each person here. It's not some shallow act of sexual immorality, but rather there's far more involved. Think about what Naomi says in the first few verses. My daughter, I must find what? A home for you. She's not thinking about some shallow act of sexual immorality. She says, we need to find you a husband, a place long-term that you can live and be under the protection of a husband, the care of a husband. And when Ruth says, in the middle of the night as Boaz wakes up, Ruth says, spread the corner of your garment over me. Now to us, that just passes right over our head. What in the world could she be talking about? But to the original readers, they knew exactly what Ruth was talking about. Because that idea of spreading the corner of your garment, or sometimes that word is similar to the word for wing. Spread your wing over me. She's not asking, again, for some shallow act of sexual immorality, but one commentator says that this act of spreading the garment over someone signified an establishment of a new relationship and the symbolic declaration of the husband to provide for the sustenance of the future wife. So essentially, picture a mother bird who brings in close the chicks next to her, putting her wing around them and bringing them close. Essentially, Ruth is saying, will you marry me? Will you bring me close, provide for me, protect me, care for me? Will you be our kinsman redeemer? Again, she does not mention any sort of shallow sexual immorality, but we see here specifically not only that reference to spread your garment over me, but a reference to kinsman, guardian, redeemer in verse 9. She has much more in mind. And Boaz responds incredibly positively. Again, Boaz's focus is not on some shallow act, but on much more than this. Because in verse 12, we find out that there's another character in the story. It's true that I'm a guardian redeemer of our family, but there's another who's more closely related than I. They all know what they're talking about. This act of the closest relative on the late husband's side who redeems, who marries the widow and cares for her. That's exactly what the text has in mind. Is it how perhaps we would expect it to be approached? Certainly not. Do I know exactly what it means that Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet? No, I don't. There's a lot of different guesses out there, suggestions based on the text and the culture, but it's just clear from the text that Ruth has in mind marriage to Boaz. This idea of guardian redeemer. But it makes us a little upset, right? There's another man in the picture who is first in line to redeem Ruth. We just think, Boaz, what are you doing? We've been waiting for you two to get married and live happily ever after, and you're going to throw her into the arms of another man? That's exactly what Boaz says. If he, this other man, will redeem you, let it be. So we have this plan that Naomi has schemed, and we have this proposal on the side of Ruth, and then we have the patient waiting. So take in verses 14 through 18 as I read them. So Ruth lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. Essentially, we have to make sure nobody assumes the worst that happened here this evening. Verse 15. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. And when she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. And then they went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Can't you just picture Naomi getting nervous? Maybe she didn't sleep much. She's wondering what happened there, how Ruth did this and that. How Boaz responded. So how did it go, my daughter? Then Ruth told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Essentially, I think of this as asking her blessing. Here, I'm going to send some grain with you to make sure I'm still in good standing with Naomi. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. And there we have the biggest cliffhanger that we've had yet. The biggest commercial break. We have to wait until next week to find out what happens to Ruth and Boaz and this other guy that we've just found out about. The question remains, what in the world do we as Christians do with this text? How does this apply to us in a 21st century context? I want you to see 3 things that I have found just pop out of the pages here in Ruth 3. First, I want you to see the unique faithfulness that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi had. And I want to call you to a unique faithfulness. But I also want you to see a unique trust that these 3 characters have and call you to a unique trust. Then we see, of course, this picture of a unique God. And I want you to see the uniqueness of our great God. So as we look at their faithfulness, first of all, I want you to remember the background of the book of Ruth. So again, look at Ruth chapter 1. But then look to the left and you'll find Judges. So 1 page before Ruth chapter 1 comes the book of Judges. And the last chapter in the book of Judges is chapter 21. And in the very last verse of the book of Judges, we find verse 25. And it describes what was going on in Israel at the time that Ruth was there in Bethlehem. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what? As they saw fit. Essentially, they completely disregarded God's laws, God's morals, and they did anything that happened to please them at the time. They ran after anything that they thought they wanted to run after. And during the time of the Judges was this downward spiral of morality for God's people. And so that's the background of Ruth. Ruth and Boaz are operating in a time of just absolute moral decay. But in our story, we see that they are showing this unique faithfulness to God's law. Remember Boaz, when he responded, realizing now that it was Ruth and realizing what Ruth was doing, he responded with, this kindness is amazing. You didn't run after younger men. Essentially, you didn't run after whatever you thought you should. But you're being faithful to God and what He has set in place through a guardian redeemer. You're also being faithful to His people, faithful to your late husband, and carrying on His name through a guardian redeemer. And so in a time of absolute moral decay, we have Ruth who is holding herself up, a Moabite no less, a Moabite woman who is acting in this sort of unique faithfulness and goes to Boaz. And we know what could have happened there on the threshing floor, but we see Ruth and Boaz hold themselves up as people who are faithful to God. And even Boaz, he could have said, Ruth, I'll do it, let's go, let's find a preacher right now, and he can marry us. But instead, he says, if we're going to obey God, There's somebody else first who, according to God's law, has the right to redeem you and your family, your land, to be your guardian redeemer. So Boaz says he has the first rights. And if he will redeem you good, I will step out of the picture. So in a time when Israel had no king and everyone did as they saw fit, Boaz did perhaps not what he wanted to, marry Ruth, but instead said, we've got to do this through God's way. So go and check with this man first. And so that's what we'll see next week. But can't you see just this unique faithfulness? Take example from Ruth and Boaz. That we are to exude a unique faithfulness. Because I would say that line in Judges, that everyone did as they saw fit, I would say that applies to the world today. As we look around us, it seems as though nobody has any regard for the God of the universe. Nobody has any regard for morals. That everybody just makes themselves their own God and runs after whatever they see fit. And so the world will expect us, encourage us, and entice us to sin. The world will be quick to do that. Expect, encourage, and entice us to sin. But in the midst of a sinful world, we are to be a people who are faithful to God, who stand firm on the Scriptures. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 puts it this way: do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't run after sin like the rest of the world. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We are to be a unique people. 1 Peter chapter 1 is speaking about us as God's children. And in verse 14, he says, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. Essentially, don't go back to the ways of the world. But just as He, God, who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. Holy is a word that means set apart. Set apart specifically from sin. That God is holy. He is set apart from sin, and we as His children are to be set apart from sin. And this is going to play out in any number of areas in our lives. It could be as we're dealing with marriage here in Ruth, that as our nation takes marriage and God's ideal for marriage and throws it out the window, we are to be a people who uniquely hold this faithful steadfastness to God's word and His ideal of marriage. That could mean any number of things, but we are to stick out as being people who are faithful to God. Could mean in the way that we love our family. Could be in the way that we love our neighbors, especially those neighbors that are hard to get along with. Could be at school. Those of you who are in middle school, high school, Aaron, Jess, Jackson, the way that I see high school or middle school is an overflowing vat of sin. All right? I don't paint high school with a very good brush, but I just see it as this overflowing vat of sin. And in high school, in middle school, you are surrounded by kids. I guess you're at a Christian private school, and so maybe not as much for you, but Jess and Jackson and Philip's boys, and soon to be Miss Charlotte too, that you're surrounded by people who just run the opposite direction of whatever we're supposed to do, according to God. That are not faithful to Christ, but instead will do exactly that, encourage you to sin, drag you along, and you are to be uniquely different in that environment. And that's somewhat bad news, because high schoolers and middle schoolers recognize different, and they don't treat different all that well. But you are to be a people that are extraordinarily faithful to the God of the universe, even in a place that just seems like it has no God, and they run after whatever they think is right in the moment. So we are to be uniquely faithful. But in the midst of that, we are to exude a unique trust as well. Think about how this could have gone. I mean, Ruth could have gotten there. Somebody could have seen her lying at Boaz's feet and gone and told the town. And everybody could have thought that the worst happened, that Ruth had caved in and not followed God's laws. Or perhaps she could have gone to Boaz and proposed. And remember, in our culture, a woman proposing to a man is a little bit unusual. It doesn't happen that often. Sometimes it's looked down upon, but especially here, not only was Ruth a woman proposing to a man, but a servant proposing to a master, a poor woman proposing to a rich man, a foreigner, a Moabite, proposing to a man of Bethlehem. This could have gone horribly wrong. Boaz could have said, you have overstepped your boundary. Now get out. Get away from me. Why did you come here in the middle of the night? And why did you make my feet cold, right? Now, if he were a Quinley, he would have worn socks, because Quinleys always wear socks. And his feet would not have been cold. We see this. This could have gone horribly wrong. But we see that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, all throughout the book of Ruth, are people who trust God. That trust that he is working not only for their good, but his glory. So they take this huge leap of faith, knowing that God is on their side, that they can trust in God. And we are to be a people who have this unique trust as well. Psalm 37:5, commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him. Psalm 62:8, trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Proverbs 3:5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Scripture screams at us to trust in the Almighty God. When George is at my parents' house, where he is now, he loves the fireplace. For some reason, kids gravitate towards the most dangerous part of the house. I don't know why that is, but he loves the fireplace. And it's got a hearth on it, or whatever that's called, there on the floor, a little ledge, and then the fireplace goes up the wall. And he loved very early on to climb up onto that ledge and to scoot himself off or just simply fall off. But he's realized that sometimes that's painful. And so now, even this weekend, he will go and he'll stand on the fireplace and he'll look at one of us and hold out his hand and say, Mama, hand, Dada, hand, Aunt A for Uncle Aaron, hand. And we'll go over and we'll grab his hand. And then, as though there were no risk involved at all, he just jumps right off the ledge. But it got me to think that sometimes as we step out in faith, it may seem like there's a lot of risk involved. But when we remember that God has got our hand, that he is working, that he is on our side, it makes it a lot easier to leap. It makes it a lot easier to live out our faith when we are trusting in God. And again, this can apply to any number of circumstances. One that comes to mind is evangelism and discipleship. We may think, I'm not going to share the gospel with them. What are they going to say to me? What if they ridicule me? What if I share the gospel with a coworker and I lose my job? Or what if everybody turns against me or I lose a friend? But Christ has called us to faithfulness. And as we step out in faithfulness, we can trust in the God that has called us to faithfulness. Again, this applies in our marriage, it applies in our workplace, it applies in our community. Step out in faith, all the while knowing that we can trust in God. And that reminds me of our unique God that we see here in the book of Ruth. A God who, just as Ruth asked Boaz to take her under his wing, to provide for her, to protect her, we have a God that has done the same. He grabs us under his wing. That he pulls us close and he provides for us. He protects us. He cares for us. And he loves us. We have a unique God who works for our good and his glory. It is splattered all over the pages of Ruth. As we read in between the lines, we see God's goodness at every turn. And it's tough for us to see God's goodness at times. It's tough for us to look at our life circumstances and recognize God's working hand, but he is working. And we can trust him and be faithful to him. So as we look at Ruth chapter 3 this morning, I want you to recognize the unique faithfulness of Ruth and Boaz. And remember that this week as you go out into whatever you do during the week. And remember that we also are called to a unique faithfulness. Remember, too, that they have a unique trust. And as we are faithful to the Lord, sometimes we might have to take steps out that may seem risky, but trust in God. And remember that he is a unique God, the one true God, the only living God, the God that sent his Son even to die for you. If you've never trusted in that God before, I want to encourage you to do so. He is willing to take you under his wing, though you are a sinner. He has poured out his love and his mercy that you may have life in heaven. So turn to God this morning. It doesn't take a pastor. It doesn't take an aisle. You can do so from your pew this morning, just admitting that you are a sinner and turning from your sin and self and following after Christ. Many of you have done so already. So remember this week, this month, this year, in your Christian life, that you are to be faithful, uniquely faithful. Different than the world, not following after the world, but instead following after Christ. Doing as Christ has laid out the good works for you to do. And remember that as you do so, we have a God that we can trust in. So how will you respond to the Word of God this morning? Let's pray.